Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into an absolute geopolitical paradox. They say that wiping out a nation's identity is actually way harder than just defeating its army in battle. And, well, if we look back at history, there is probably no other community that has faced such relentless, systematic attempts to literally erase its land, its language, and its very existence. We're talking about a nation that is very much alive, breathing through millions of people, but is completely 100% absent from the map. 35 million, or 3.5 crore. That is the global population of the Kurds today. Just to put that massive number into perspective for a second, that's enough people to outnumber the entire population of Australia. Yet, despite those numbers, the Kurds hold the incredibly heavy title of being the largest stateless ethnic group on the entire planet. So, who actually are the Kurds? Well, they're an indigenous community, and their roots go deep, thousands of years deep, into the soul of the Middle East. They share an incredibly rich language, a vibrant culture, and very distinct traditions. But if you pull up a modern map right now, you'll see Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey. But right there in the middle of them, the name Kurdistan is nowhere to be found. It's basically a dream, carried in the hearts of millions of people who are living without a recognized country. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the Forgotten Nation, then move into World War and broken promises, look at how they were erased from the map and divided across four borders. After that, we'll cover geopolitics, alliances, and betrayals, and wrap up with identity beyond borders. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Forgotten Nation. To really understand this community, we have to look all the way back to their origins in the rugged Zagros Mountains. I actually found this super fascinating. Their very name is tied directly to the rugged terrain they called home. A lot of historians believe the word Kurd comes from an ancient term meaning slingers. These were fierce mountain warriors, famous for defeating their enemies just by slinging stones from high mountain peaks. So that deep connection to the mountains of the Middle East, it's absolutely foundational to who they are. These early Kurds settled across a huge area. We're talking modern-day Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and even Armenia. And they built a really prosperous culture. Now, sure, they were made up of diverse tribes with different dialects and traditional dress, but they were deeply, deeply unified by the strong sense of community. When Islam spread in the 7th century, the Kurds adopted the new faith, but they fiercely held on to their cultural traditions. And they produced some truly legendary historical figures, like the great Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who famously led Muslim armies to capture Jerusalem back in 1187. He was a Kurd, and he brought immense pride to his people. But you know how history goes. As time marched on, major empires rose up and the Kurds got caught right in the crossfire. By the 16th century, the Middle East was essentially dominated by two massive superpowers, the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire. Since the Kurdish population was spread right between them, both of these empires were terrified that a unified Kurdish uprising could threaten their power. So what did they do? They made this calculated, highly strategic move to deliberately divide the Kurdish tribes. They'd give some a little autonomy while completely crushing others. It sparked internal conflict and effectively stopped a unified Kurdistan in its tracks. Which brings us to Section 2, World War and Broken Promises. Let's look at how the chaos of the 20th century completely flipped their destiny upside down. The 20th century brought what you can only call geopolitical whiplash. 1914, World War I kicks off. Fast forward to 1916, and Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically deciding they're going to just carve up the Middle East for themselves once the Ottoman Empire falls. Then, in 1920, there's this huge ray of hope. The Treaty of Sevres is signed, officially promising an independent state of Kurdistan. But literally just 3 years later, in 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne is signed, locking in the region's borders. And guess what? Kurdistan was completely gone. Section 3, Erased from the Map. This right here is where we see one of the biggest historical betrayals play out. So the turning point is this stark, crazy contrast. On one hand, you have the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, officially promising the Kurds their independence. It was finally supposed to happen, but then the Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, fiercely fought back against foreign occupation, which dragged Western powers back to the negotiating table. The end result? The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. This new treaty completely scrubbed Kurdistan off the map. Why? Simply because Britain and France were laser-focused on securing oil reserves and regional dominance. So they just chopped the territory up across 4 brand new borders instead. The destiny of millions wasn't decided on the battlefield, but via pens and maps in conference rooms. It's a heavy thought, right? Colonial interests and this insatiable thirst for oil basically achieved what centuries of invasions couldn't: the total fragmentation of the Kurdish people. Literally overnight, millions of Kurds woke up as minorities in their very own historical homelands. Moving into Section 4, divided across 4 borders. Let's unpack the severe reality of what happens when you're split into 4 brand new nations. So one unified people suddenly found themselves facing 4 totally distinct nightmares of systemic oppression. Over in Turkey, it was a campaign of forced assimilation. In Iraq, they went from facing horrific, unthinkable atrocities to eventually carving out some autonomy. Down in Syria, they endured decades of statelessness before forming self-rule during the chaos of the civil war. And in Iran, they had a brief, fleeting moment of independence that was violently crushed. 4 borders, 4 totally different struggles for survival. Let's look a little closer at Turkey, for example. Right after the division, the Turkish government kicked off this incredibly harsh campaign of cultural erasure, aiming for absolute cultural uniformity. They went as far as officially labeling Kurds as Mountain Turks. The Kurdish language? Banned. Traditional music? Banned. Even saying the word Kurd was strictly forbidden. It was a literal, legal assault on their entire identity. And tragically, this oppression frequently tipped over into unimaginable violence. The historical record here is grim, to say the least. In Turkey, after rebellions against that forced assimilation we just talked about, the 1937 Dersim massacre resulted in the tragic deaths of 40,000 Kurds. Decades later in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, the Anfal campaign deliberately targeted Kurdish villages. This peaked in a horrific chemical weapons attack on the city of Halabja in 1988. Over 5,000 innocent people were killed instantly. These are absolutely massive, devastating historical losses for the Kurdish people. When you push a community to the brink like that, armed resistance and political movements are naturally going to emerge. In Turkey, Abdullah Öcalan founded the PKK in 1978, launching a guerrilla war for independence. The Turkish government later designated the PKK as a terrorist organization, leading to a deadly conflict spanning decades. Over in Syria, Kurdish forces, known as the UPG, along with the all-female UPJ, played a massive frontline role in defeating ISIS, with backing from the US. And in Iraq, after Saddam Hussein fell in 2003, the Kurds managed a rare, historic success, establishing the KRG, which is a constitutionally recognized semi-autonomous government. Section 5. Geopolitics, alliances, and betrayals. You see, the Kurdish struggle hasn't just been against the neighbors next door. It's deeply, deeply tied to foreign superpowers, specifically this repetitive cycle of involvement by the United States. Honestly, it's like a broken record. There is a stark 4-step historical pattern at play here. Step 1. Foreign powers encourage a Kurdish rebellion against a mutual enemy. Step 2. They provide temporary support, maybe some weapons. Step 3. The moment their own political goals shift, they abruptly pull that support. And Step 4, they leave the Kurdish population entirely vulnerable to devastating military blowback. We literally saw this exact cycle play out in the 1970s with Iran and Iraq, then again in the 1991 Gulf War, and even as recently as 2018 in northern Syria, when the US abruptly pulled troops out and left Kurdish forces exposed to Turkish military offensives. Yet, despite everything we've just talked about, the dream of their own state has never faded. In 2017, Iraqi Kurds actually held a historic referendum for independence. A staggering 92% voted yes for an independent country. 92%. But in a harsh reminder of their geopolitical reality, that overwhelming democratic voice was swiftly ruled unconstitutional and rejected by the Iraqi government, shattering the dream all over again. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Identity Beyond Borders. How on earth does a community survive when the world flat out refuses to draw its borders on a map? The answer to that is just incredible, undeniable resilience. The Kurdish identity is thriving today against impossible odds. There's a massive Kurdish diaspora across Europe and America that is actively keeping their roots alive through art, documentaries, and films. Those traditional languages we mentioned, like Kurmanji and Sorani, are still proudly spoken and sung today. And every single year, they light the fires of the Newroz Festival. It's not just about a new year, it symbolizes their enduring, totally unbroken fight for identity, for respect, and for their very existence. Which leaves us with this really profound final question. Will Kurdistan ever actually exist on a geopolitical map? Or, after centuries of betrayal, forced assimilation, and constantly shifting alliances, are its true borders simply the unbreakable resilience of its people? It's the kind of story that really forces us to stop and question what actually makes a nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.